We're going to go ahead and get into the second part of our navigation lesson today, and we're going to talk about general considerations for plotting a course, as well as regulations associated with that, and then VOR and GPS navigation. Just as an overview, the general flight planning process includes a few steps. So first thing you want to look at is prepare a flight overview, and we're going to go over all these steps individually, but just to introduce it here. Step number 2 would be developing a route, then obtaining a weather briefing, completing a nav log. We're not going to have time in this class to go over a complete nav log. That's going to be something reserved more for one-on-one instruction with your flight instructor. It's more of an introduction as to what goes into that. Then filing a flight plan, how to do that, and who you contact for filing that flight plan, and then performing your pre-flight tasks. First, we'll look at performing a flight overview, and one of the first steps for this is determining or considering the feasibility of this flight, meaning is this flight even possible? Given terrain surrounding the flight, performance of the aircraft, are you going to need to make fuel stops? Consider the date and time that you're going to be performing this flight. Gather all your flight planning materials and consider your training experience. Are you taking passengers with you? And if you are you current? Do you need to do your 3 takeoffs and landings within 90 days to be current? Or maybe even more if you just want to be extra precautious or more proficient for that flight. When it comes to assembling necessary materials, we covered this a little bit last time, but just to reiterate, make sure that your aeronautical charts are up to date. You want to make sure that they're current, so that way if there were any frequency changes or airport closures, you're aware of that. And along with your chart, make sure your chart supplement is also up to date, and study the chart, study the route. If there are any symbols that you're not familiar with, make sure to look those up either on the chart legend or Aeronautical Chart User's Guide. When it comes to developing your route, you want to look at a few things. Consider checkpoints that you're going to be using. Make sure you're using prominent waypoints or checkpoints along your route, something that you can see from the aircraft. One of the easiest things to do when developing a route is to just make a straight line. The shortest distance is a straight line from point A to point B. So I always recommend starting with that method, and then you can make modifications to your route based off of surrounding airspace, terrain, any nav aids that you're going to be using, like a VOR that we'll talk about, your cruising altitude. And so as you develop this route, you're going to notice that it starts to change. It's going to include a lot more turns, and it's going to deviate a little bit from being a straight line. So when it comes to flight planning, we generally use a combination of pilotage, which is using landmarks to navigate, as well as dead reckoning. And dead reckoning is going to involve calculations, determining your course or your route, as well as making wind corrections and things like that. Here's an example of a navigation log, or we usually just call it a nav log. And most of the time we teach this using paper. Eventually you may want to move on to using something like ForeFlight, which is considered an electronic flight bag, or something like SkyVector, has some online flight planning tools that you can use. I generally teach people to use a combination of both electronic means as well as paper nav log. And the reason for that is using kind of this old school mentality of a paper nav log is a lot more thorough and conservative, but I do like the convenience of electronic, and so if you kind of use a combination of both, you're using the convenience of an electronic method while also being very thorough in your flight planning and conservative in your calculations. When it comes to completing the nav log, I kind of think about it in 2 parts. The left side, you can kind of think about that as your route. So you're planning your true course, your route, your altitude, and direction of flight, whereas the second half, considering wind correction and a few other things, you are obtaining the performance of your aircraft. So what is going to be the eventual compass heading, how long are these legs going to take you, and how much fuel you're going to burn for this flight. When it comes to obtaining a weather briefing, I know we talked about this a little bit with our weather lesson, but now we're going to think about it in terms of our flight planning. You generally want to start looking at the weather about a week in advance. So let's say a week from now you want to plan a flight, you look at the news. For people that still watch the news, pay attention to the weather, look at the weather app on your phone or check it online. And if a week from now you notice, oh, there's going to be thunderstorms, the weather's going to be bad, you can already tell in advance you're probably not going to do that flight. So although these are not approved weather sources, you can still get a general idea for what the weather is going to be looking like a week from now. So the day before your planned flight, you can actually get an Outlook briefing, which if you remember is going to be more than 6 hours out from your flight. It's not going to be as detailed as a standard briefing. It's based off of forecasted weather, which is not always the most accurate, but it'll give you a better idea of what weather is going to be like. The day of your flight, you can get a standard briefing, which is going to be more detailed about your departure airport, en route forecasts, as well as your destination. And if you're on the fence or if your flight gets delayed a little bit, you can obtain an abbreviated briefing, which is going to be just kind of updated weather for that flight. So you can do that either over the phone, 1-800-WX-BRIEF, or on their website, 1-800-WXBRIEF.com. I like using both. I generally will have students practice over the phone. I know a lot of people don't like talking on the phone anymore, but it gives you a nice personal touch. You can ask questions to the briefer over the phone. Either way, I recommend making an account on 1-800-WXBRIEF.com. That way your phone number is saved, and when you obtain a weather briefing, that will be saved to your account. When it comes to filing a flight plan, you could do it using those same resources over the phone or online. And your flight plan is going to include information about your route of flight as well as your time. And the purpose of filing a flight plan for a VFR flight is for search and rescue purposes. So if you do not arrive to your destination based off the predicted times, they'll try to contact you, or they will send out search and rescue if they're unable to contact you. There's kind of two parts to this. When it comes to filing a flight plan, you're creating the information and you're creating the flight plan that will be stored, but you actually need to activate this flight plan once you're ready to fly. You can do this over the phone, so you can call them. You can do it through email. So if you file the flight plan on their website, they'll send you an email to Easy Active. When it comes to filing a flight plan, there's a couple ways you could do it. After you file the flight plan, you'll need to activate it. And there's a couple ways you could do that. When you're flying, you can do it airborne on 122.2 or using a local flight station frequency. Or you can do it over the phone, calling them up. Or if you file it electronically, they'll send you an email and you can use that email to activate your flight plan prior to departure. So either at your parking spot or in the run-up area, you can activate that flight plan and not have to do it while airborne and while distracted. It's important to note that after you land at your destination, you'll need to close this flight plan. Otherwise, it remains open and they will try to contact you if you do not close it or arrive on time. So if you do not close that flight plan within 30 minutes, they'll try to contact you. So it's important once you touch down and get to the parking spot, close the flight plan. This is what the form looks like for your ICAO flight plan. ICAO stands for International Civil Aviation Organization. And I know it says international on here, but this is the general breakdown that they want you to use for even local VFR flight as well. And you could get asked about this even on the written test, just about certain details on here. So something like item 15, it refers to cruising speed and level. So when it says level, that just means your initial requested altitude. So if your route is going to include multiple altitudes where you change direction and maybe need to change altitudes or maybe need to change for weather or something, you're just going to report your initial cruising altitude. And when it comes to destination aerodrome, number 16, use the 4-letter identifier. So if it's a US-based airport, it's going to start with a K followed by the 3-letter identifier. You'll only need to file one flight plan, even if you have a couple stopovers. So maybe you need to stop for fuel, and then you continue on your route. You just need to file one. The only case that you would maybe file multiple is if it's going to be a longer stopover. So if you're planning to stop for like an hour or longer, maybe just to take a break or get some food or something, anytime that stopover is more than an hour, you'll want to file separately. And when it comes to endurance, point number 19 right here, that's asking you the amount of usable fuel in the airplane in terms of hours and minutes. So not necessarily gallons, but just the time or the amount of fuel you have. And when it comes to contacting a flight service station, there's multiple ways you could do this. The universal frequency is 122.2, but you want to use the local frequency, and that's always going to be preferred. So you can look in the back of the chart supplement, and it's going to have a flight service station communication frequency section here. In the case of Southern California, there's a couple, but right here we have Riverside Radio, and it's going to cover all of these areas. And so depending on where you are in your route or where your airport is based, find the nearest one and you can contact them on that frequency. You'll notice a few of these have multiple frequencies. So in the case of Hector Vortac right here, it says 112.7 T. That T means transmit. It's a little bit confusing, but that T means that the flight service station transmits on that frequency. So that means that they talk to you on that frequency. And then there's an R, which means receive. And that is from the perspective of the flight service station. So that means that they listen to you or receive your transmission on that frequency, which would be 122.1. You'll notice a couple of these say RCO. That stands for Remote Communications Outlet. So that means that nobody is stationed at this location. It's kind of like a relay station. So at this remote communications outlet, you can contact them on that frequency, but then that transmission gets sent to the actual flight service station. So in the case for John Wayne, if you look at the sectional chart, it'll say Santa Ana RCO, Remote Communications Outlet, and then the name of the station is Riverside. In the chart supplement, it's a little bit easier to read because they're all laid out like this, but you can actually use your sectional chart to contact flight service as well. So if you look at Palm Springs, here's a communications box, the Palm Springs VOR. Here's the frequency for the VOR, and we're going to talk about VORs in a minute, but this first frequency, you can actually talk to them, you can actually listen to them on that frequency on 115.5. So you'd put that into your navigation radios, and then you can talk to them on 122.1 because they receive your communications on that frequency. So you can use these communication boxes to contact flight service, or you can use the one in the chart supplement to plan ahead and use those frequencies as well. When it comes to determining a cruising altitude, there's a few things that you want to look at. One of those is 91, 159, and those are going to be your VFR cruising altitudes. And this goes into when you're in level cruising flight more than 3,000 feet above ground level, you need to maintain these altitudes. So on a magnetic course, not true course, of 0 degrees through 179 degrees, which means basically east, you want to pick an altitude that is odd plus 500 feet. So that would be something like 3,500 feet, 5,500 feet, or 7,500 feet or beyond. And if you're flying between 180 degrees through 359 or west, pick an even altitude plus 500 feet, 4,500, 6,500, 8,500. So that's one of the considerations we make when determining altitude for a flight. So here's an example of a written test question you could see. Which VFR cruising altitude is appropriate when flying above 3,000 feet AGL on a magnetic course of 185 degrees? So if you remember, 180 through 359 is going to be even plus 500. This one, you can kind of shortcut a little bit. If you remember, VFR cruising altitudes always include 500 feet, meaning even or odd plus 500 feet. So A and C would automatically be wrong because those do not include 500 feet. Another consideration are fuel requirements. So 91, 151 goes into how much fuel we need to have on board the aircraft. So this says no person may begin a flight in an airplane under VFR conditions unless, considering wind and forecast weather conditions, there's enough fuel to fly to your first point of intended landing and, assuming normal cruising speed during the day, fly for at least 30 minutes, and if you're flying at night, for at least 45 minutes. So that's kind of the bare minimum. I always recommend making your personal minimums higher than that because you'll quickly realize getting to a destination and only having 30 minutes of fuel is pretty low, and it could be a little bit scary, especially for an inexperienced pilot with unreliable fuel gauges. And when it comes to performing your pre-flight tasks, so consider your preparedness for the flight, meaning are you proficient? Have you flown recently? Check the maintenance logs for the airplane, perform a thorough pre-flight inspection, including maintenance logs, like I said. And when it comes to performing the flight, so we call it a navigation log because you're not only including your flight planning information, but you're also logging information as you fly. So it's a proactive log. What that means is as you're flying, you are verifying your performance with your predetermined calculations. A lot of times I notice that students will begin a cross-country flight, especially the first couple times they try this, and they will put their navigation log in the side pocket or it'll stay in their backpack along with their aeronautical charts. So like I said, it's proactive, meaning you're going to carry this on your knee board and you're going to have your charts available. So as you fly over your specified waypoints, you're going to verify the time with what you predicted. So if you're supposed to go from A to B and it's going to take you 12 minutes, make sure you start a stopwatch for departure, and then you should verify that time against what you calculated. When it comes to pre-departure, try to set up everything you can on the ground. So that way, as you fly, you're not having to do this, while you fly, while you're trying to juggle all these tasks. So tune all of your communication frequencies. So you're going to need ground, tower, departure. If you're using something like flight following, tune your navigation frequencies. Again, we haven't gotten into VORs, but if you're going to be using a VOR, make sure you tune those beforehand so you're not having to search for those frequencies while flying. Program your GPS if you're GPS equipped and planning to use it, and set a course. So if, depending on your airplane, you may be able to set a course or set a heading bug, set an altitude bug. Some additional things are to brief your initial course, your altitude. So in the run-up area, even just talking to yourself, if you're flying solo, do a briefing. Talk to yourself, say, oh, my initial course is going to be blank. I'm going to be flying at altitude blank, and then identify at what points you're going to be doing frequency changes. And make sure you set a timer. Like I said a minute ago, you're going to want to verify your leg times versus what you have on your nav log. So it's really important that you set a timer. I always teach people from day one, before you're cleared for takeoff, tell yourself lights, camera, action. So what that means is lights, pretty straightforward. Make sure all your lights are on before takeoff. Camera is referring to your transponder. Make sure it's on and reporting altitude. And action, so that's going to include things like mixture. Make sure your mixture is set for the conditions of your flight. Full power, at least in a small plane and larger aircraft, you're not always going to be using full power. That could also include set your timer. So from day one, it's a good habit to always set your timer for takeoff. Doesn't always make sense when you're just flying to the practice area to learn how to fly and practice maneuvers, but it's a good habit that's going to carry over into your cross-country flight planning. Sometimes when people don't have a habit of this, they go to do a check ride or they go to fly a cross-country flight and they forget to set a timer. Sometimes it can be considered a failure if you forget to set a timer because you can't verify your en route times with what you planned. Your climb and initial cruise. So as you climb, once you get to a safe altitude, you no longer have to maintain best rate of climb or best angle of climb. You can begin a cruise climb, and that'll allow you for better forward visibility, better engine cooling because you have a faster airspeed. And then with initial cruise, once you get handed off, you can contact flight service to activate your flight plan. You can contact departure frequency if you're using flight following. En route, so just to touch on it a little bit more, you're using your nav log proactively, meaning as you're flying, you're verifying your times and checkpoints with what you had planned. Because we're using a combination of pilotage and dead reckoning, you should be able to see these waypoints that you've chosen, and the math should match up to what you've predicted regarding pilot, and the math or calculations should match up with what you predicted for your dead reckoning. So you should be monitoring these differences Any discrepancies, you should be able to understand why. Maybe the wind changed, maybe you're at the wrong power setting, but you should stay fairly busy as you're doing this cross-country flight. And this is more for people that are just getting into cross-country flight planning. A lot of times they kind of treat it as like sightseeing, like, oh my gosh, I'm leaving the practice area for the first time, and then they end up just looking around without actually actively monitoring their calculations. When it comes to diversion conditions, there's a few things that would warrant a diversion. One of those would be deteriorating weather. So en route, maybe some clouds rolled in, maybe a storm is coming, nightfall. So if it's starting to get dark and you're not night current, you're not equipped for night flight, whatever the reason, low fuel. So if you're burning more fuel than you predicted, and you may need to divert to a closer airport. Other ones would be system malfunctions. Could be health reasons, so whether that be the pilot or a passenger, anybody having medical problems or just feeling ill, you'll probably want to divert. So when it comes to diversion, or especially loss procedures, there's a couple things to cover. An aircraft in distress. So distress means a condition being threatened by imminent danger, requiring immediate assistance. Something that's defined as urgent would be any condition that could adversely affect flight safety. So if you are lost, I always tell people the 5C rule. You can see a couple of these everywhere. There's 3 C's, 4 C's. I like 5. It stands for climb. So initially you want to climb to get a better vantage point, and your radios are going to work better with line of sight. Communicate, so talk to ATC. 3 is confess, tell them that you are lost. It's a little bit embarrassing and people may be a little bit scared, but tell them what's happening. 4 is comply, follow what they say, and then the last one is conserve. So if you need to conserve fuel or conserve power for whatever reason, do that. And lastly is ELTs. Those could be activated manually or on impact with higher G-force. And just as a review, we talked about these with systems, but replace or recharge after 1/2 of battery's useful life. Or if you've used that for more than 1 cumulative hour, you can actually test your ELT. You can do that in a screened room, which I've never seen one, but that's an option. Or you can also do it during the first 5 minutes after the hour, but make sure you don't do that longer than 3 audible beeps. So when you're doing your pre-flight, and if the time happens to line up, or you can even plan for this, make sure you do it within the first 5 minutes after the hour, and you could listen in on 121.5 to make sure that your ELT is activating. Once you've decided to divert, there's a few actions that you want to consider. I always tell people aviate, navigate, communicate. And you may have heard this before, but what it means is you want to make sure you're controlling the airplane before anything else. Sometimes people get so caught up with trying to navigate or determine like a course, or they're trying to contact ATC or talk on the radio. It's more important to make sure you remain in control of the airplane and coordinated. Then you can worry about navigating or planning to your diversion point, and then communicating this with ATC. So your very last focus should be communicating. You don't want to lose control of the aircraft or get lost even further because you're worried about, punching in a flight plan to your GPS or talking on the radio. So fly the plane first, and then begin turning your airplane toward the airport for intended landing. And while you're doing that, you can complete your flight plan details. So one of the easier ways to do it is a calculator method. You may be asked and trained to do it using an E6B, but what you want to be able to determine is the approximate heading to your diversion airport, the distance to that airport, the time it's going to take you, and how much fuel you're going to burn to get to that airport. So what you can do is take your speed, multiply it by distance, and that'll give you the time it's going to take you to fly that leg. Then you can take your time, divide it by 60 minutes, multiply that by your gallons per hour, and that'll give you fuel burn. So for a small aircraft, during cruise flight, you're going to burn between 8-9 gallons. A conservative method is to round up to 10, just to make math a little bit easier. And from that, you can determine how much fuel you're going to burn for that leg. Once you've done all that, you can inform controllers of your situation and request any assistance if necessary. So that is one of the resources that you have. You can talk to ATC, you can ask for frequencies, you can ask for approximate headings to a diversion airport. So if the weather is getting bad, you can ask what's the nearest airport reporting VFR. You can request the ATIS frequency, the tower frequency, and heading to get there. And so they are a resource to help you. Sometimes people are a little bit timid about it, but once you present a situation that's urgent or even an emergency, ATC will drop, everything necessary to help an aircraft in need. When it comes to planning your descent, there's a few things to consider. Tuning frequencies. So as you're approaching your airport, you want to have frequencies at your destination ready to go. And then planning your descent, easiest method to do this is to take the amount of altitude you need to lose to go from your cruise altitude down to the traffic pattern altitude. Divide that by the rate of descent. So if you want to lose 500 feet per minute and need to lose 3,000 feet, you would do 3,000 divided by 500. Over here is another example where this airplane needs to lose 3,700 feet and they're planning on descending at 700 feet per minute. That comes out to 5 minutes. So if your ground speed is 120 knots per hour, multiply that by 5 minutes, divided by 60 minutes, and it comes out to 10 nautical miles. So you can work backwards, take your destination airport, and then 10 miles away from that destination, you can mark your point of descent. Before approach and landing. So as you approach the airport, start scanning for traffic, make sure you obtain the ATIS and have your frequencies ready to go. Generally, your workload is going to be highest when you're close to an airport. So whether that's departure or arrival at an airport, you're going to become a little task saturated. You're going to have to tune radios, talk on the radios, fly a traffic pattern, descend. And so you want to be able to do things as much in advance as possible. So listen to ATIS pretty far out. As early as your radio will pick up the ATIS, I recommend start listening to that. Visualize and plan your entry into the traffic pattern. And then once you contact tower, if there's a tower, generally they will assign you a runway, or you can request one. If necessary, start planning how you will enter that traffic pattern. And then post-flight considerations, after you land and clear the runway, you want to comply with all taxi instructions. Always have a taxi diagram available, even if you're using an iPad or an electronic flight bag. Always have a paper one as a backup, especially if it's hot out. The sun's been beating down on your iPad. It's pretty easy for those to overheat and shut down. So at that point, you don't really have a taxi diagram available. So have a chart supplement with you, or just print out the taxi diagram for the airport you're going to, as well as any possible diversion airports. Make sure you close your flight plan afterwards. And I always tell people, evaluate your flight. A lot of times, if you're doing this as an instructional flight, your instructor will go over this with you. They'll say, how did it go? They'll recommend, some ways to improve the entire process. But once you're licensed and flying on your own, it's still good to keep up that practice of evaluating your flight. Ask yourself, how did that go? How could I improve it for next time? And considering all phases of flight, so departure, en route, arrival, even how your landing was. Start critiquing your own landings and how you could do better. Next, we're going to do some other methods of navigation. The first one we'll cover are ground-based navigation, specifically VOR. So we've talked about it a little bit. We've mentioned VOR, but that stands for Very High Frequency Omnidirectional Range. So it's kind of a mouthful, so that's why we use VOR instead. But what that means is it's a ground-based station that provides magnetic bearing information to or from the station. So we use this information to navigate. And I'll show you what that looks like in a minute, but these are called high frequency because they operate on the high frequency range between 108 and 117.95 megahertz. And just like your communication radios, these are strictly line of sight, meaning if you're too low on your altitude or if you're behind terrain, your VOR may not pick up like it would at higher altitude. So the way these stations work is you have your VOR on the ground and it's emitting radio waves in all directions. And the equipment on board your aircraft is able to detect which direction you're either flying to or from the station based off your position. So this is what a VOR station would look like, kind of like a little cone on the ground. Again, these emit radio beams, we call them radials, in all directions or outward from every direction. And it's important to note that these radials do not cross the center of the VORs. So it's kind of like spokes on a bike. They only go from the center outward. They do not cross over the middle. And when it comes to identifying a VOR, there's a few ways that it'll be depicted on your aeronautical charts. If a VOR is co-located at an airport, you'll have the runway layout, and it's going to have an open circle or dot at the airport itself. And so that means that there's a nav aid, in this case specifically a VOR, at that airport. And it'll also be surrounded by compass rose that give you the magnetic direction or orientation of that VOR. If it's a standalone VOR, there's a few different depictions it'll have. So just a standalone VOR is going to be a hexagon with a dot in the center. If it's a VOR-TAC, which means VOR plus TACAN, and TACAN means Tactical Air Navigation, used by the military, it'll look like this. And if it's a VOR plus distance measuring equipment, meaning it's able to provide your distance from the VOR as well, if you had the equipment, it's going to have the VOR enclosed in a square. Along with that, it'll also have the frequencies used for those VORs. So in the case of Salem right here, it's 114.3. So you'd put that into your navigation or your receiver, and you can use that to navigate. As far as aircraft equipment, there's a few different things that you should have on board in order to use this VOR. You'll have antennas. Usually those are going to be located on the back of your tail, and those are going to be navigation antennas. You'll have a receiver, which looks like this. On the left side, you have communication radios or frequencies, and on the right, you have navigation frequencies. So they work the same. These are volume knobs, so you can turn up the volume for the communication, volume for the navigation, and then these are tuning knobs right here. And you'll also need an indicator, which we call a course deviation indicator, or CDI. And there's a few things to point out on this CDI. In the middle right here, you have a CDI needle, which tells you your orientation to that VOR. You have a to from indicator. So if it points up like this, it'll say to, or it'll be an upside down triangle and it'll say from. And then you have an OBS knob right here, so you can twist that knob and it'll change the orientation of the CDI based off of what you're trying to do. If the signal is unreliable, you'll see a red flag pop up as well. When it comes to using a VOR, there's a few procedures to consider. First, you want to tune the VOR, and then you also need to identify the station. So what that means is you're verifying that that station is functional. And the way we do that is we listen to Morse code associated with that VOR. So you'll see here, there's Morse code following the frequencies for these VORs. Look at this Morse code and listen over the radio, and you should be able to match up what you're hearing to what you see on your chart. And it's important not to just listen for the beeps, but you also want to verify that it matches this VOR, because you could have the wrong VOR. If you don't hear any audible beeps, what that means is either the station is down for maintenance, you're too far, or you've lost line of sight, or maybe you've tuned the wrong frequency. And so there could be a few reasons, but in order to use this, you want to make sure that it actually makes the sound and it matches up with what you have on your aeronautical charts. So a couple ways you could do that. Looking at this receiver right here, you'll notice that this volume knob says pull ident. So what you can do is you pull this knob out slightly, and then you can adjust the volume a little bit, and you should be able to hear that Morse code over the radio. Other ways you can do it, if you happen to have something a little more fancy, like a Garmin 430 that looks like this is a volume knob, and you should be able to either push or pull that too. And if you fly something like a G1000, it'll do this by itself. So If the frequency turns green and it has the identifier after it, it means that the G1000 has verified that Morse code for you. So those are important steps before you actually use the VOR to make sure you tune and then ID it. A lot of times people forget to identify it, and in that case, let's say it's a testing situation like a checkride, that could be cause for failure if you fail to identify the station prior to using it. Another place you could look at to make sure that it's working are your NOTAMs. So check your NOTAMs before you go fly, and it'll tell you, hey, X, Y, or Z VOR is out of service, and so you know beforehand you can't actually use it instead of waiting till you're airborne. Now we'll get into interpreting VOR indications. So once you've tuned and ID'd a VOR frequency, you can determine your position just by twisting that OBS knob and aligning the CDI needle in the center. So anytime that needle is centered, it means that you're currently located on that radial. If you notice that the CDI needle is off center, it means that you're not located on the radial. Easy way to visualize it is imagine that the airplane is located right here on that indicator, or even on the center. And whatever side that needle is on, it means that you need to chase that needle in order to get to the course. So in this case, this airplane would need to turn to the left in order to find that needle. One of the hardest parts about identifying or determining your course with a VOR is understanding the difference between a to and a from flag. So when you have a to flag, the number that reads at the top of the CDI is going to be your bearing or your heading. The number on the bottom is going to be the radial in which you're located. So if we look at this VOR station here, here's the airplane. If we draw a straight line from the VOR to the airplane, based off of the compass rose right here, it says 1, 2. That means you're on the 120-degree radial from the station. So if this airplane wants to fly to that station, you can look at the opposite side of that station. It says 30. So this airplane needs to face or head 300 degrees in order to fly to the station. So if we apply that to the CDI right here, this plane needs to fly 300 degrees as they're heading, but they would be located on the 120 radial. So with a to flag, radial is always on bottom, heading is always on top. With a from flag, it's a little bit more simple. So let's say this airplane wants to fly to the right or away from the station. So if this airplane turns its nose over to the right, it would be facing or heading the same direction as the radial. So in that case, with a from flag, they'd be heading 120 degrees and they'd also still be located on the 120-degree radial. So that's where the confusion, or a lot of confusion, comes from, is the difference between how to read a to flag versus a from flag. So with a to flag, the heading and the radial are opposite one another. When you're flying from the station, your heading and the radial are the same. There's something called reverse sensing, and this is not something that you intentionally do, but it can be an error that you get with a VOR. Anytime you fly opposite to what you've programmed the CDI, you're going to have reverse sensing. So if we look at the airplane A as example, so this airplane looks like it's flying towards this station, or it's flying to the west, but it's programmed to have a from flag. So this plane is kind of doing the opposite of what they told it to do. So in this case, this airplane, you notice that the radial is to the right of this airplane, but the indication shows that the needle is to the left. And so the needle swings to the wrong side because it thinks you're trying to fly away from the station or outbound. So in order to correct this, they would have to turn the OBS until you get a to flag, and then the needle would actually show on the correct side. It would show on the right side here. Airplane B right here is accurate because they're flying away from the station. They've programmed a from flag and the needle's to the left. So this airplane would need to turn to the left in order for this needle to center. So again, it's not something we intentionally do, but it could be a programming error in case you're flying opposite to what you've programmed. There's some off indications. There are some cases in which you would get no flag on that indicator, and this is what it would look like. So directly over the top of a VOR, there's something called a cone of confusion. So whenever you're passing directly over the VOR, your flag will disappear. So if we look at where this airplane is located here, they have a 2 flag, they're flying a heading of 120, and they're on the 300 radial. Once you pass directly over the VOR, the flag will disappear. And then once you cross over the station, the flag will flip. So meaning it'll go from to from. You'll notice that the numbers don't change. You're still flying a 120 heading, but now you're on the 120 radial. There are some other situations in which you would get no flag, and those are when you're at a 90-degree angle to what you've programmed. So this plane is programmed to have 120 at the top, but they happen to be 90 degrees away from that. So meaning they're on the 030 radial. So anytime you're 90 degrees away from the radial that you programmed, it'll indicate with no flag. So that'll be important when you're actually flying a VOR or on a practice question or on the written test. You could see that as well. And when it comes to tracking, we'll kind of go over the steps of what that would look like. So in step number 1 right here, this plane is to the right of the radial. So the idea is that you want to be directly over the radial and follow that to the station. You'll notice that the needle swings to the left. So if you chase the needle, this airplane corrects to the left. It begins to get closer and closer. That needle starts to swing. Now they're directly over the top of that radial, so the needle is centered, 2 flag, but then they overcorrect and the airplane actually passes over the radial in the other direction. Now the needle starts swinging to the right side. So this plane needs to correct and adjust, go back to the right, needle is centered again, and they follow that directly to the station. So it's important to note that the VOR does not understand wind correction. It's not able to detect that. So you as the pilot may need to fly some wind correction or adjust as you fly. So that's tracking a course. Now when it comes to intercepting a course, you can use a VOR, determine what radial you want to fly to get to or from a station, program that on your CDI, and then you fly your airplane to intercept and then track that radial. So what that would look like, if we look at position number 1 right here, this airplane has a 2 flag and they're flying on the 250 radial on a 070 heading. So that's what that would look like, 070 on top, 250 on the bottom. But they notice there's some weather up ahead, so they decide to change course and intercept a new radial. So they twist the OBS and they said, oh, I want to go intercept the 270 radial instead. So they twist it, then it becomes an east heading on the 270 radial, and you notice that the needle swings to the left. So this airplane needs to turn to the left to intercept that. Now, a good rule of thumb is about a 45-degree intercept angle. So when you want to intercept a radial, just turn 45 degrees toward that radial, and that'll set you up for a good angle to intercept it. If you're really far away, you may want to do a more aggressive intercept angle. If you're really close to the radial, you may want to do less. But 45 is a good rule of thumb. And the way I visualize that in the airplane, if you don't want to, do math, you're not very good at it. If you look at your CDI right here, you got north on the left, east on top, and if you just imagine a 45-degree intercept between these 2 points, just fly the heading that's the halfway point between these, and that'll set you up for a good 45-degree angle. So as this airplane gets closer and closer to its radial, it'll start to center. So I know this is a lot at first. It kind of feels like you're drinking from a fire hose, But the more you read about it or use some examples for a VOR and eventually practice it in the airplane, it'll start to make a lot more sense. If you happen to have access to a simulator at home, I recommend hopping on that and trying to practice using this. It'll start to make a lot more sense. So another method that we can use for a VOR is cross-checking our position, or we call it triangulation. And with this, we're using radials coming from different VOR stations to basically mark an X of your location. So what that would look like is if we look at position 1 right here, this is Red Bluff VOR. This airplane is flying away from the station and they happen to be located on the 161 radial. And they want to determine their location. So if you draw a line from Red Bluff and then on a second VOR, or even using the same one, program a different VOR. In this case, we're looking at Chico. Determine what radial you're on from Chico VOR. It looks like 243. So if you make an X from both of these VORs, so Red Bluff would be the 161 radial, and then a cross radial of 243 from Chico VOR, where these two radials intersect is going to tell you your location. So what you do is just center each VOR, and then using your aeronautical chart or electronic flight bag, you can draw a line from each of these VORs, and where they intersect, that's going to tell you where you're located. So it's a good technique to determine your location, especially during lost procedures. If you're unfamiliar with where you're at, look at your aeronautical chart, find the nearest VOR stations, and then pinpoint your location. So at that point, if you're just trying to find your location for distance information, or you can even track this VOR to this airport if you happen to be lost or need to divert. Here's some examples of VOR locations. So we'll start with aircraft A right here. They're located on the 360 or 0 degree radial. And it's important to note that the VOR does not know your heading. It just determines your position. So you'll notice that a lot of examples have airplanes turned in all directions. So if you pay less attention to where the nose of the airplane is and just think about the airplane as like a dot or a circle, it doesn't matter what direction it's facing. It matters what you've programmed it to do and what your location is in proximity to those radials. So airplane A right here happens to be on the 360 radial, and it's centered because that's where they're located. So the CDI would look like this. They have a from flag, and they're on the 360 radial right there at the top. Airplane B, on the other hand, is not located on the radial, but they have a to flag. So this airplane would need to correct to the right in order for this needle to center. So this airplane needs to turn to the right, center the needle, and then they can continue to fly to the station. Airplane C, programmed it to have a to flag, and so if this airplane were flying to the station, they would need to turn to the left to intercept that. It's kind of confusing again because this airplane is facing east, but they've programmed it with a to flag. So if you just turn this airplane around, it would make sense that this airplane needs to turn to the left to intercept that radial. So without paying attention to the airplane, if you just look at this indication right here and you make a 45-degree intercept on the side of the needle, you know this airplane needs to turn to about a 220 heading. So this plane needs to turn 220 in order to intercept this radial. So we'll skip along a little bit. I know there's a lot of examples to go over here, but we'll just skip ahead. So let's go over some practice questions. And these are going to be kind of challenging at first, but hopefully after we go over a couple, they'll make a little bit more sense. This one says refer to figure 20, area 3, and figure 28. So you're going to use a couple of figures. One of those is going to be CDI indications, and one of them is going to be part of a chart. The VOR is tuned to the Elizabeth City VOR, and the aircraft is positioned over Shawboro, and that's a small town 3 nautical miles west of Currituck County. Which VOR indication is correct? So let's take a look at these figures, and your first step is to find the location of the airport, which is going to be Shawboro right there, and I'll zoom in a little bit. So that's where the airplane is located. So now we need to figure out what radial we're on from the station and look at the examples to see which one of these indications is correct. So if we draw a straight line, you can use the numbers right here on the compass rose to determine which radial you're on from the airport. So 0 is going to be identified with this long arrow right here, and it'll say 0 at the top. And it's a little bit hard to see, but under some of these markers is going to be 030 right here. Each one of these tick marks represents 5 degrees. So we got 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, 30. So the arrow's a little bit off, but the airplane's going to be on the 030 radial from that airport. So if we look over to the right, easiest way to handle these is just deduction. So anything that's not an answer choice, you can already, stop looking at that because it's not going to be an answer choice. So that leaves us with answer 2, 5, or 8. So which one of these matches up with 2, 5, or 8? So if we look at number 2, it says from flag, 210 at the top, 030 at the bottom. And if you remember, anytime we have a from flag, that means that you were on a 210 radial and also flying a heading of 210. So that would mean that the airplane is actually located somewhere over here, kind of closer to Harvey right here. So that one's not accurate, so you can automatically cross out number 2. Number 8 says that you have a 2 flag, which would mean that you're flying a 030 heading, but you're located on the 210 radial. So that would place you at the same location flying to the station. Number 5 has a 2 flag, flying a heading of 210 on the 030 radial. This is the only answer choice that would line up because this airplane is located on the 030 radial, and if they're flying 2, that's what that would look like. And that leaves us with answer choice C, number 5 right there. So this next one we look at, you'll realize that it's a little bit more challenging than the other one, but hopefully after we go over it, it makes some sense. The only figure that represents CDI indications is figure 28. So every question based off of VOR is most likely going to use figure 28. And so you'll kind of realize a pattern there. This one says the VOR is tuned to the bottom vortex, area 3, and the aircraft position is over Sulphur Springs Airport, area 5. Which indication is correct? So this one gives us number 1, 3 or 7, and number 8. So if we take a look at these figures, we have figure number 24, and then our answer choices, and I've highlighted the only ones that are answer choices. We could automatically cross out the ones that are not answer choices, so that leaves us with 4 CDIs right here. Up here on the top left, it's a little bit hard to see, is the bottom vortex. So first thing you want to do is find your aircraft position. So it says we're over Sulphur Springs. So your airplane is right here. And the VOR we're using is right here, bottom VOR. Based off the answer choices, you can see that we're either on the 210 or the 030 radial from this VOR. So here's the 210 radial, and 030 radial would be off the chart here. But you're located here. So the airplane itself is on the 120 radial from the bottom vortex. So anything that's centered as an answer choice would be automatically incorrect, right? Because we're either on the 210 radial or the 030 radial, which would be off the page. But the airplane is over here towards the southeast. So you already know that answer choice 8 would be incorrect. So if we look at our remaining choices, we have number 1 right here that says a 2 flag, 210 heading on the 030 radial. So that would place the airplane somewhere over here, which would be incorrect. So if you remember, anytime we're located at a 90-degree angle to what we programmed, we're not going to have a flag indication. So anything with a flag would also be incorrect, but we can confirm that just by looking at these figures. Number 1 would imply that the airplane is somewhere over here, which is not correct. We're at a 90-degree angle over here. We already crossed out number 8, And so that leaves us with either number 3 or 7. Those are the only ones that have no flag and could also be answer choices. So if we go back to the question, we already know that 8 is incorrect and 1 is incorrect because that one did have a flag indication. So that leaves us with answer choice B. When you plan on using a VOR, you want to check accuracy for that VOR. This is only going to be required for IFR flight if you're using the VOR, but it's still a good idea to use it for VFR flight. A couple ways you can do that is using a VOT, and that stands for VOR Test Facility. So not every airport has these, but you can check the chart supplement for your airport to see if you do have one located at your airport. And a VOT transmits a 360-degree radial in all directions. So instead of having every number within a 360-degree radius or a 360-degree circumference, you're going to have just a 360-degree radial transmitted on this frequency. It kind of works similar to a regular VOR, but the test facility transmits at the airport and it transmits 360-degree radial in all directions. So what you do is you program your course to have 180 degrees at the top with a 2 flag, and it should center the needle. And then you'll program it to have a 360-degree indication at the top with a from flag. And this should have a plus or minus 4-degree error. A certified checkpoint, so in the chart supplement as well, you can find a checkpoint, and that's going to be a specific point on the airport, and that should also be within 4 degrees. You can do an airborne check, so you could fly a Victor airway and identify a prominent feature on that airway. This one is the only one that's going to be within 6 degrees rather than 4. And the last one is a dual receiver check. So if you happen to have dual receivers in your airplane, you can tune both of these receivers to the same VOR, tune it to the radial, whatever centers, and they should be within 4 degrees of each other. So once you do that, you want to record who performed that test, so your name, which test you did, the error for that, as well as the date. Some aircraft are equipped with an HSI, which stands for Horizontal Situation Indicator. You could have a mechanical one, or if you fly something with AG1000, there's an HSI rather than a heading indicator. And what this means, it's a combined heading indicator with a VOR indicator or navigation capabilities. And it's kind of nice because instead of looking at 2 different indications or 2 different instruments, you just look at one instrument and it overlaps your navigation over the top of your heading indication. So it prevents a lot of error when you're trying to scan between two different instruments. So this reduces errors because you no longer have to look at 2 different instruments, and it also prevents reverse sensing and other visualization problems. So this is what it would look like. It has a heading indication around the outside, and then there's a what we call a lubber line, which is kind of your CDI needle in this case. Then you have a course selector knob right here, works like your OBS, and then you have a heading select knob, also known as a bug. So if you need to if you need to set a bug, you can just twist that knob and this indication will change. I mentioned distance measuring equipment before. If your aircraft is equipped with DME, you can not only use a VOR, but you can also tell your distance from that VOR. That's usually going to include an antenna on the underside of your aircraft and a receiver that looks like this. So on that receiver, it's going to tell you your distance from the VOR, your ground speed, as well as your time to get to that station. Another piece of equipment is going to be ADF, which stands for Automatic Direction Finder, and it's an older technology than a VOR. It works somewhat similar. So you're going to have an antenna underneath the aircraft, a receiver that looks like this, which is going to have a channel on it, and then a bearing indicator that looks like this. So a difference between this and a VOR is that this is always going to point towards the NDB or the station. And the way that you would fly using this is you have the station right here. And since that line always points towards it, kind of like a compass always points towards the north, you can fly directly to that station using homing, meaning flying that heading, and it'll get you to the station. Now we're getting into GPS. So A lot of modern airplanes are equipped with GPS, but not all of them. We still have airplanes that are 40, 50, 60 years old that may not have GPS in them, or you can choose to upgrade and have one installed in your aircraft. But the GPS, or Global Position System, is based off of a constellation, and that constellation includes 31 satellites. The system ensures that at least 5 are always visible, and you need a minimum of 4 stations in order to establish an accurate 3-dimensional position. So since we are flying an airplane, we need not only lateral position, but also altitude, or 3-dimensional position as well. GPS works off of something called trilateration, meaning that the distance measured by how fast your signal travels from the satellite to a receiver in your aircraft, and then that distance is calculated using 3 satellites at the same time. So a GPS receiver can determine its general position, meaning latitude and longitude, but it does require a 4th satellite to provide a more accurate position as well as your 3-dimensional position. So there's a system called WAAS, that stands for Wide Area Augmentation System, and it uses a series of ground stations that provide a corrective message, and it just ensures the accuracy of your position. So if a GPS can provide your position within about 15 meters, WAAS kind of upgrades that accuracy between 1 to 2 meters. And so this becomes even more important when it comes to using a vertical glide path for people that are flying instrument approaches. Another system in place is RAIM, that stands for Receiver Autonomous Integrity Monitoring. So it means that your system is monitoring the strength of your satellite signal to make sure that you're receiving a continuous and accurate signal. Lastly, just an overview of some GPS equipment on board your aircraft. FMS, which stands for Flight Management Systems, and Navigation Database. So if you're using a GPS, you want to verify that that database is updated. It's kind of like the electronic version of your aeronautical charts. You want to make sure that those are updated if you're going to be using that. Includes a course deviation indicator, includes a moving map depending on the GPS you're using, waypoints, GPS flight planning. So as you're learning to use your GPS, you want to understand how to load waypoints, how to load a leg for a flight plan, navigation data, including determining your track, the track itself, distance, and intercepting and tracking a course. So you will still learn how to use older technologies like a VOR, even if you do fly something like a G1000 or an aircraft equipped with GPS. It's just you'll need to also learn how to use the GPS on top of that. So when it comes to the written test, you'll be tested on both. You could be tested on some basic GPS equipment, but a lot of times you'll also get asked about a VOR. So it can be a challenge if you haven't started flight training or haven't used a VOR yet. It's something you'll be expected to know for the written test. So that wraps up our lesson for navigation. So we'll get into a quiz, and if you have any questions, just let me know.